Bratislava. In an apartment in the center of the city, the body of a man is found, 42 years old. Just a year earlier, he had been one of the most powerful communists in Czechoslovakia. He had been General Secretary of the Communist Party of Slovakia. He had sat on the Presidium of the Central Committee of the KSČ, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, as one of 2 Slovaks in a 21-member body. In February 1948, he had personally directed the takeover of Slovak security forces. And 10 months earlier, from a parliamentary tribune, he had accused 2 of his own colleagues, Vladimír Clementis and Gustáv Husák, of espionage and subversive activity against the state. The police would close the case as a suicide, but speculation about murder would also emerge. The funeral would take place without public honors. This man's name was Štefan Bašťovanský. He was the type of figure that recurred again and again in communist regimes during the 1950s. A perpetrator one year, a victim the next. A man who sent his colleagues to prison, and whom the same machinery ground up only months later. Today we'll trace his journey from a young Slovak communist, through a brief collaboration with the regime of the Slovak state, through the peak of his power in Žilina 1945 and Prague 1949, all the way to his fall and death in a Bratislava apartment. The story of a man who moved in the shadow of Klement Gottwald and Viliam Široký, and who in the end met the same fate as many of those he had himself denounced. Štefan Bašťovanský was born on February 7, 1910, in Budapest. Yes, in Budapest. The Slovak Communist, who 4 decades later became General Secretary of the KSS, came into the world in the capital of the Kingdom of Hungary, still under the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. His family later moved to Slovakia, where Bašťovanský grew up. He was politically formed in the turbulent 1920s. He took the classic path of a young Slovak left-wing activist of the interwar period. Studies, journalism, joining the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. In his publishing and editorial activities, he came across as a radical. But during the interwar period, he wasn't yet among the highest party functionaries. He remained in the second tier. And then came March 1939. The breakup of Czechoslovakia, the creation of the Slovak state. And here we come to one of the darkest stains on Bašťovanský's biography, a stain he never properly explained, and which would destroy him 10 years later. At the end of 1939, Štefan Bašťovanský submitted an application to join the Hlinka Slovak People's Party, the ruling party of the Slovak state, a party whose leaders openly aligned themselves with political collaboration with Nazi Germany. For Bašťovanský, it was a brief episode. He then spent 3 years working at the Ministry of Transport of the Slovak state. Those are bureaucratic years performed under the banner of a regime that deported Slovak Jews to German extermination camps. What exactly Bašťovanský did there, how he reasoned about it, why he submitted the application, and why he stayed at the Ministry of Transport for 3 years, he never publicly clarified. Sometime in 1942 or 1943, Bašťovanský turned away from the regime. He joined the Slovak Communist resistance. After the outbreak of the Slovak National Uprising in August 1944, he became involved in the fighting. After the uprising's defeat, he crossed the front to the Soviet Army. And in May 1945, he returned as a rehabilitated former resistance fighter, ready to take his place in the new republic. But the application to the Hlinka party remained in the archives, a file that someone one day would open. In April 1945, immediately after the liberation of Bratislava, Štefan Bašťovanský became chairman of the National Committee of Slovakia's capital. he held the post for only 2 days. The party immediately pulled him out of municipal politics and onto a higher floor. In August 1945, at the Communist Party of Slovakia conference in Žilina, Bašťovanský became the General Secretary of the party. It was an enormous step. The General Secretary of the KSS was the second man of Slovak politics, right after the party chairman, Viliam Široký. And it was Široký who pushed Bašťovanský into this position. For Bašťovanský, this was the key relationship of his political life. Široký was his patron. Široký held his future in his hands. In that same year of 1945, Bašťovanský became a member of the Provisional National Assembly in Prague. He defended his seat in the parliamentary elections of 1946, now as a member of the Constituent National Assembly. And again, in 1948, Bašťovanský was a typical functionary of the new type. Disciplined, loyal, without his own political vision, but all the more reliable in carrying out decisions from above. For the party leadership, he was the ideal man. A general secretary who didn't make his own policy. He just implemented what Široký and Gottwald told him. And in 1948 came the moment when there was a great deal to implement. The February coup of 1948 took place in Prague. That's the image we all know. Klement Gottwald on the balcony of the Melantric building. The resignation of the non-communist ministers. President Beneš signing the appointment of the new government. But the coup didn't take place only in Prague. It also took place in Bratislava. And there it was, led by Štefan Bašťovanský. In February 1948, Bašťovanský led the so-called Party Fivesome, a 5-member leadership of the KSS that controlled the security forces in Slovakia. That meant the State Security Service. That meant the National Security Service. That meant the police. That meant direct deployment of armed force against political rivals, against the Slovak Democratic Party, which had won the 1946 elections with more than 60% of the vote. The Fivesome, under Bašťovanský's leadership, crushed the Democratic Party in Slovakia within a few days. Members of the Democratic Party were removed from public office. Some were arrested. Slovak politics was transformed within a single week from nominally pluralist to effectively monopolist. For this action, Bašťovanský received his reward. In July 1948, he was co-opted from the Central Committee of the KSS to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia in Prague. And in May 1949, at the 9th Congress of the KSČ, he was elected to the Presidium of the Central Committee as one of 2 Slovaks in a 21-member body. The other was Viliam Široký. Bašťovanský became one of the most powerful men in the state. He sat in the room where everything was decided: the economy, the churches, the trials, the executions. He sat at the table with Gottwald, Slansky, Kopecký, Čepička. And at this table, there was one task that would come to him. He was to expose hidden enemies within the Communist Party of Slovakia. In 1949, a systematic campaign began within the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia against hidden enemies in the party. It was a Stalinist-type theory imported from the Soviet Union, that the most dangerous enemies of communism are hiding inside the party itself. That constant vigilance is needed. That names are needed. In Slovakia, this task fell to Štefan Bašťovanský. He became the chief actor in a group within the KSS, whose job was to deliver names. And it delivered. In February 1951, at a session of the broader leadership of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, Bašťovanský delivered a report. It was a long, detailed, politically polished document. And in this document, there were names. The first name, Vladimír Clementis, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Czechoslovakia, a Slovak Communist intellectual, lawyer, journalist, one of the most educated people in the party. Bašťovanský designated him as a member of an espionage and subversive group. The second name, Gustáv Husák, at the time Commissioner for Transport of the Slovak National Council, also designated as a member of the same group, and further names, further charges. For Clementis, it was the end. He had been arrested in January 1951. In November 1952, at the same time Bašťovanský was dying, as we'll see in a moment, Vladimír Clementis was sentenced to death within the Slansky trial. On December 3, 1952, he was executed at Pankrak prison. For Husák, it was the beginning of 16 years in prison. First investigative custody, then a court trial in 1954, a life sentence. Husák left prison only in 1960 and was fully rehabilitated only in 1963. Bašťovanský's February 1951 report wasn't the only reason all of this happened. Pressure was coming from above, too, from the Soviet Union. But Bašťovanský was the one who put the names into the resolution. It was his voice that rang out from the parliamentary tribune. It was his signature on the document. And it was the way Bašťovanský proved his higher standing. He was General Secretary of the KSS. He was a member of the Presidium of the KSČ Central Committee. He was the man who delivered the names for the great trial. And at exactly the moment when his power was at its peak, an enemy file opened against him. In October 1951, just 8 months after the report against Clementis and Husák, Štefan Bašťovanský was removed from the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party of Slovakia. He received the function of Departmental Secretary of the Central Committee of the KSS. That was the first downgrade. 2 months later, in December 1951, came the second. He was shifted to the Slovak Pedagogical Publishing House. From a General Secretary, he became a personnel worker at a publisher of school textbooks. Why? The official reason was the discovery of a document in the archives. That application to the Hlinka Slovak People's Party from the end of 1939. The communist apparatus suddenly discovered that Bašťovanský, the General Secretary of the KSS, one of 2 Slovak members of the KSČ Presidium, had been ready, at the end of 1939, to become a member of the ruling party of the Slovak state, and had spent 3 years working at the Ministry of Transport of that state. But the application had been in the archives for a long time. It came to light precisely when someone needed to bring it out. And when we look at who benefited most from that, one name comes up: Viliam Široký. The man who 7 years earlier had pushed Bašťovanský into the position of General Secretary was now the same man who was throwing him out of it. The factional struggles in the highest organs of the KSČ were intensifying, and Bašťovanský was someone who could be sacrificed. In January 1952, Bašťovanský resigned his parliamentary seat in the National Assembly. He stayed silent. No press conferences, no self-criticisms, no appeals, just silence. And on November 27, 1952, he was found dead in his apartment in Bratislava. He was 42 years old. The police reports concluded that the death had occurred without the involvement of others. Suicide. But speculation about murder also emerged. Bašťovanský was a man who knew a great deal. He knew how the indictment against Clementis had been written. He knew who had actually had the file brought out. He knew who had stood behind the takeover in the KSS in 1945 to 1948. For some of his former colleagues, a living Bašťovanský could have been a bigger problem than a dead one. These speculations were never confirmed. The truth about his death will probably no longer be uncovered today. But the fact remains, Štefan Bašťovanský died in the very same month in which Vladimír Clementis received the death sentence in Prague. The man who delivered the names and the man whose name he delivered met in death only days apart. The funeral of Štefan Bašťovanský took place in Bratislava without public honors. The former General Secretary of the KSS received a civilian farewell. His name disappeared from public discussion for decades. The story of Štefan Bašťovanský is the story of a type that recurred with cruel regularity in communist regimes during the 1950s. First, a perpetrator, then a victim, a man who denounced others until he himself was denounced, a functionary who made sure Vladimír Clementis ended up at the gallows and Gustáv Husák behind bars, and who himself then ended up dead in a Bratislava apartment under unclear circumstances. For Slovak political memory, he remains a complicated figure. He is no hero. He is no clean victim. He is a man who helped build the machinery that finally ground him up, and who ground along with it for as long as it allowed him. Some kinds of guilt history names, some fates remain in the silence of the archives. Tell me in the comments how you see it. Was Bašťovanský primarily a perpetrator who got what he was doing to others? Or was he too a victim of the system he had become entangled in? Should his application to the Hlinka party from 1939 have been a legitimate reason for his removal? Or was it just a political pretext in an internal power struggle? And do you think the police closed the investigation of his death correctly as a suicide? Or did the truth disappear forever into the archives? If this episode gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It helps the video reach more people. If you're new here, subscribe. I'm preparing more stories from 20th century Czechoslovak history. And ring the bell so you don't miss it when a new episode goes up. Thanks for watching. See you next time.